In the wind-scoured silence of Cimarron County, Oklahoma, where the earth once breathed life but now exhaled only dust, the Whitaker family lived with quiet resolve until the land itself turned against them. James, a lean man of 35 with hands calloused from honest work, had come west in 1928 with his wife Clara, a former schoolteacher whose steady grace held their world together. They bought 160 acres of flat, treeless prairie, lured by government pamphlets promising fertile soil and a future built by grit alone. With nothing but hope and sweat, they built a 2-room shack, dug a well, and planted wheat beneath a sky that once seemed generous. Their son Henry was born in 1929, and their daughter Sarah in 1931, both children of the land, their first cries echoing in a home they believed would stand for generations. For 3 years the dream held. Rain fell when it should. The wheat grew tall and golden. James even bought a second-hand Fordson tractor, its black paint gleaming like a promise kept. But the promise was built on a lie. The topsoil that nurtured their crops had been held in place for centuries by deep-rooted buffalo grass, grass that had been ripped away during the wheat boom of the 1920s to feed a nation at war and feed a speculative frenzy. When the rain stopped in 1931, the land had no defense. The drought crept in like a thief, stealing first the spring showers, then the summer storms, leaving behind a sky hardened into a pale, unblinking dome. The wheat withered, the garden failed, the well ran shallow, and then the wind began to carry more than air. It carried the land itself, ground to fine red powder, lifting in great black clouds that turned noon into night. The first real duster hit in 1932. A wall of dirt so dense it blotted out the sun, shaking their walls and filling their lungs with a gritty metallic taste. They stuffed wet rags under doors, nailed burlap over windows, and huddled the children in the center of the room, their faces wrapped in damp cloths. When it passed, their world was buried halfway to the windowsill. Sarah, just a toddler, developed dust pneumonia, a wet, rattling cough the doctor could not cure. She survived, but their hope did not. Over the next 3 years, the storms became a cruel rhythm, arriving weekly, sometimes daily, each one stripping away a little more of their dignity, their health, their future. Neighbors vanished overnight, leaving behind empty houses and rusted tools. Banks foreclosed on farms that could no longer feed a single family. The government offered pamphlets on soil conservation, but no real aid. James took odd jobs in town for pennies. Clara bartered sewing for flour or lard. They ate corn mush and dandelion greens, stretching a single potato into 3 meals. Henry stopped asking for toys. Sarah stopped pressing wildflowers into ledgers. They moved slowly, spoke softly, conserved everything, even breath. The dust was in their food, their beds, their Bibles. It coated their wedding photo, turning their younger selves into ghosts. Yet they stayed, not from stubbornness, but because they had nowhere else to go. Their credit was gone. Their savings were dust. Their pride was all that remained, and it would be shattered on April 14th, 1935. It began as a deceptively calm Sunday morning. The sky was pale blue, offering a false truce. James checked the window's last trickle of water. Clara kneaded their final cup of flour into bread. Henry traced letters in the dust on the floor, a quiet act of learning in a world that no longer taught its children. Sarah sat at the table, drawing a sunflower taller than their house, its petals bursting with impossible colour from a seed catalogue. "For when it rains again," she told her mother. Clara kissed her forehead and whispered, "Soon, baby," a lie spoken not to deceive but to hope. But soon never came. At 1:30 p.m., the horizon turned black, not dark, but an absolute wall of dirt, so dense it blotted out the sun, advancing faster than a man could run. James, outside tending their last chicken, saw it and shouted for Clara as he sprinted home. She pulled the children inside, and they worked in frantic silence, boarding windows, stuffing cracks, wrapping faces in wet cloths. But the storm hit before they could seal the last gap. The wind howled like a beast, shaking the foundation, rattling the few dishes left on the shelves. Dust poured through every seam, thick, suffocating like being buried alive in ash. The lamp flickered and died. In the darkness, Sarah began to cough, a deep, wet, terrifying sound that ended in a whimper. Clara held her tight, rocking and humming through gritted teeth. James relit the lamp. In its pale glow, he saw his family, Clara's tear-streaked face, Henry's wide eyes, Sarah's small body convulsing, and he knew he had seen this before. With no doctor, no medicine, no strength left in her, the dust would take her. The storm raged for 4 endless hours. When it passed, the world outside was unrecognizable, a moonscape of dunes where fields had been, the road buried, the fence gone. Inside, the air was thick with grey powder. Sarah lay limp in Clara's arms, her breathing shallow. They gave her water, held her close, prayed the old prayers. But at 5:47 p.m., her chest stilled. She was gone. 4 years old, buried under a sky that had forgotten how to weep. They buried her that night by kerosene lamp beneath the gnarled oak she loved to climb, her body wrapped in a clean flour sack Clara had saved for emergencies that never came. James carved a cross from driftwood and planted it at her head. There were no words, no hymns, just the low, mournful wind. They went to bed without eating, without speaking, the weight of loss heavier than any June. Clara stared at the ceiling, replaying Sarah's last smile. James lay awake, his mind a storm of grief and guilt. At midnight he rose, lit the lamp, and sat at the kitchen table. He found a sheet of paper, the back of a feed bill stained and creased, and began to write. His hand shook, not from cold, but from unbearable sorrow. He wrote not to a friend, but to the future, to anyone who might find this testament in the ruins of their home. He wrote of their arrival in 28, full of hope, of golden harvests that turned to dust, of the slow unravelling of their world. He wrote of Sarah's last day, her drawing, her trust, her belief in sunflowers even when the sky was black. He described the storm, the darkness, her final breath. He did not beg for pity. He did not curse God, he simply asked to be remembered. We were real, we loved, we tried. He wrote of Clara's broken spirit, of Henry's silence, of his own helplessness. He described the foreclosures, the empty roads, the government's empty promises. He named no enemies, but his words were an indictment, a quiet accusation against a system that lured families west with lies of abundance, then abandoned them when the soil gave out and the wind took the rest. He wrote until his hand cramped, until the pencil lead broke, until the ink smudged with his tears. Then he signed his name, James Whitaker, and the date, April 14th, 1935. He folded the letter, tucked it inside Clara's Bible, and hid it beneath a loose floorboard near the hearth, a final act of preservation in a world bent on erasure. He returned to bed, but did not sleep. He listened to Clara's quiet sobs and Henry's shallow breathing, and made a decision. They would leave, not tomorrow, now. 2 days later, at dawn, James hitched their last mule to a rickety wagon. They packed what they could carry, a change of clothes, a few cans of beans, Clara's mother's locket, Henry's wooden horse, and the Bible. They left the door unlocked, the table set, the windmill frozen. They did not look back as they turned onto the buried road, their footprints filling with dust behind them. They walked 10 miles to Boise City, sold the mule for $5, and caught a ride to Amarillo. From there, they boarded a bus to Bakersfield, California, joining the river of Oakley's flowing west toward rumors of work. They settled in a migrant camp on the edge of the Central Valley, tents and shacks housing gaunt-faced families from Texas, Arkansas, and Kansas, all bearing the same hollow eyes and coughs. James found work picking oranges, 12 hours a day for 10 cents an hour, his hands blistered and bleeding by sunset. Clara washed clothes for other workers, her skin raw from lye soap and dust that never left her pores. Henry, too young to work but old enough to understand shame, stayed in the tent, playing with his wooden horse in the dirt, his silence a shield against a world that mocked his origins. They were called Okies with a sneer, assumed to be lazy or ignorant simply because they were desperate. The locals did not see the pride it took to stand in line for day labor. They did not see Clara's eyes, still searching for a flower in the barren rose. They did not see James's back, bent not from age, but from grief. In the winter of 1936, James developed a cough that deepened into a wet, gasping wheeze. He worked through it until one morning he could not rise. Clara took him to the county hospital, but they turned him away. No money, no insurance, no room. He died 3 days later in the camp infirmary, alone, his last thought perhaps of a little girl drawing sunflowers in a world that had forgotten the colour yellow. Clara buried him in a pauper's plot with a numbered marker, soon lost to time. She and Henry stayed in California, moving from camp to camp, always one step ahead of eviction. She eventually found work as a maid in a ranch house near Fresno, sleeping in a converted tool shed, sending Henry to a segregated school where children called him Dust Boy. He grew silent, his only solace a tattered copy of Treasure Island he found in a trash can. He never spoke of Oklahoma, never mentioned his sister. When he turned 18, he enlisted in the army, seeking a different kind of storm to lose himself in. He fought in Europe, saw horrors that made the dust seem gentle, and came home with a purple heart and a silence deeper than any June. He never married, never settled. He drifted from town to town, working odd jobs, drinking too much, sleeping in rooming houses with peeling wallpaper. He died in 1992 in a veterans hospital in Phoenix, his body claimed by no one, buried in a communal grave with a stone that read only U.S. Veteran. Clara had died decades earlier, in 1957, in a state-run nursing home in Sacramento, her mind clouded by age, but her hands still clutching the Bible she'd carried from Oklahoma. In her sparse belongings, a social worker named Eleanor Ruiz, whose own grandparents had fled the Texas plains during the Dust Bowl, found the worn Bible. Inside, tucked in the Book of Lamentations, was a yellowed piece of paper, its edges frayed, its pencil script faded but legible. Eleanor recognized its value not as a historian, but as a granddaughter of survivors. She felt the weight of those words in her bones. She donated it to the National Archives in 1978, where it was catalogued as Whitaker Letter, Cimarron County, 1935. For 40 years, it sat in a climate-controlled box, a ghost among ghosts. Then, in 2018, a historian researching migrant narratives requested it. She read James's words in the quiet reading room and wept, not just for his loss, but for the thousands of families whose stories were never written down, never preserved, never given a voice beyond the wind. She published an excerpt, and slowly, the story began to circulate, not as a footnote, but as a human face on a colossal tragedy. Today, the letter is preserved in a mylar sleeve, its fragility a metaphor for the lives it represents. It is not displayed in a grand museum, but in a small reading room where researchers can request it with gloves and reverence. It is not a call for pity, it is a demand for memory. James Whitaker did not know his plea would be answered. He did not know his family's name would outlive the dust. He wrote in the dark, with no audience but God, and yet, here we are, reading his words, feeling his grief, honoring his love. His tragedy was not unique. Thousands of families met similar fates, erased by drought, abandoned by policy, forgotten by time, but his letter survived, and in its survival, it becomes more than a relic. It is a covenant, a promise that we will not look away. The Dust Bowl was not a natural disaster. It was a man-made catastrophe, born of hubris that believed the earth was an inexhaustible resource, that ploughing the prairie was progress, that profit mattered more than stewardship. The Whitakers were its victims, but they were also its witnesses, and through this letter they bear witness still. We remember Sarah, who believed in sunflowers even when the sky was black. We remember Clara, who carried her grief like a second skin, but never stopped working, never stopped loving. We remember Henry, who sought redemption in foreign wars and quiet rooms, his silence a language of its own. We remember James, who in his darkest hour chose to write rather than vanish without a trace. Their home is gone, reclaimed by the wind. Their graves are unmarked. But their story endures, not in monuments of stone, but in the quiet act of remembrance, in the turning of a page, in the hush that falls over a room when their letter is read aloud, in the resolve to protect the vulnerable from being sacrificed to indifference. This is their legacy, not triumph but truth, not victory but vigilance, and as long as we choose to remember, the Whitakers are not gone. They are here in the rustle of dry grass, in the taste of dust on the wind, in the fragile, enduring power of one last letter written in the dark, so that we might see the light and honor those who walked through the storm and did not make it out. Theirs was a true American tragedy, not because they failed, but because they were failed by the very promises that drew them west. And in remembering them, we honor not just their memory, but our responsibility to ensure that no family, in any time or place, is ever again left to write a last letter, buried in dust, waiting for someone to listen. The dust may bury houses, but it cannot bury truth. And so, we listen, we remember, we bear witness, for James, for Clara, for Henry, for Sarah, for all who vanished into the storm, leaving behind only a whisper in the wind and one last letter, waiting to be found.